Okay, so I just wanted to start by saying a very big thank you to Kuda for inviting me, and also for the very rich conversations that I've had the last 3 days, which have really moved my thought on. On Wednesday, I gave a lecture about Victor Shklovsky's critique of the political economy of art, and that kind of connects quite nicely to this book presentation between Mama and Kuda, with quite a few of the themes of the books. And the presentation I'm going to give today explores this kind of territory in terms of what I've been thinking of as an aesthetic relations of production, and which I talked about on Wednesday, and we've been talking about somewhat the last couple of days in informal conversations. But rather than the figure of autonomous art, I explore this kind of thematic much more through the messy and heteronymous culture of music and partying and legality, illegality. I have to say thank you at this point also to Mama, because the text for this lecture draws upon was commissioned and published in the Reader on Radical Media. So since this is available, both in book form and also online. Yeah, oh great. I'm going to read a little bit from an updated version, but also I'm going to try and deviate from the script as much as possible and involve some of the actual music and cultural material that I'll be talking about. So my kind of starting point for this text or talk was at Club Transmediale in Berlin in 2013. A panel comprised of Lisa Blanning, Lee Gamble, Steve Goodman, Mark Fisher, and Alex Williams, many of them prominent contributors to 1990s and 2000s UK dance, theory, and protest culture, discussed the so-called Death of Rave. The discussion took a surprisingly psychological, nostalgic and melancholic turn. And this approach met with strong criticisms from the audience members, both those who were too young to have experienced the period in discussion and felt further alienated by its mystification, and those who experienced the same period but differently. And I would kind of include myself among them. Personally, I found myself in the latter camp. If the pessimistic subjectivism of some of the panelists irritated, and this is somewhat out of character for a usually astute political commentator such as Mark Fisher, even more disturbing to me was the apparent lack of provision of a wider social context, or any evidence of the materialist or forensic approaches usually considered appropriate to the study of a corpse. So in an attempt to redress some balance to the discussion of the lost dead object of rave culture, this talk traces a history of raves, illegal parties, music, and protests in their percolation through independent media, video, pirate radio, flyers, record labels, zines, and small press. Rather than asserting a cold, objective rationality, totally inappropriate to its subject, my talk will consider the personal discoveries and employment history of a suburban subject, which was myself. So literally my experience, however subjective, it was at the time, and with a little bit of looking back at the whole phenomenon and trying to examine that experience in relation to kind of what we know now, to hindsight. So I take this approach to argue that neither culture nor personal experience are separable from a wider economic framework, nor is class composition, and these political factors are very much accessible through material culture, i.e. media. And the talk, especially in this instance, I'll try to kind of focus on some of the kind of sedimentations and remains of this culture, what I see sort of very much kind of living in terms of some of the strands that are interesting about that culture now. So just to kind of start off, this was very much a moment, or a part of this scene, which I didn't experience directly myself at all. So this is a compilation of dance kind of videos and early acid house tracks. So this is sort of 1989. I would have just left primary school. I would have been 11 at this point. So I'm just going to play the beginning of a track, and then just leave dancers maybe silent behind me for a little while. Can technically do that.
I can make you do anything for me. Cocaine speaking. I can make you do anything for me.
So it's like a whole 2 hour-long compilation. It's pretty kind of amazing to me, at least. At this point in the kind of late 80s, house was becoming a global phenomenon from its kind of beginnings in kind of queer underground clubs in Chicago and Detroit. It had begun to kind of spread out and become and be sort of projected across the world to, I remember a person who was a teenager in '89, a friend of mine, saying that she saw these images on TV and they were like, people looked amazing, they looked incredibly fit and healthy, their dresses, their clothing was incredible, it was really impressive. So it's also, so it's kind of there's the track that's playing is called Your Best Friend. It's about cocaine and about the kind of negative controlling effects that cocaine can kind of imply on the body. And what you see is people kind of very much, in a way, kind of losing themselves, kind of some of them actually dressed as secretaries or dressed in this very sort of aspirational way, which was quite common in the 80s, common to 80s style. But in a sense, they're kind of like really kind of getting out of themselves, and you'll see later people really losing it, as we say in the dance. So in 1993, I was turning 16. I lived in the suburbs of East London on the London-Essex border, so really at the edge of the forest. The town where I grew up, Chingford, was a commuter town, as I said, on the edge of a forest, typically suburban. And during the week, the local train line to Liverpool Street took the majority of inhabitants back and forth from home to work. Many of the people who lived in my town worked in the financial service industries in the City of London, what we call the City of London. I, with many of my peers, had developed already a fierce desire to escape the rat race of this commuter life, to become something other than wage labor. And this desire, though rarely fully articulated in these terms, manifested itself as so many tiny acts of rebellion against the conditioning of education, adult rationality, and the banality of a disciplinary culture that seemed to always isolate us as individuals as a prelude to some form of punishment. I'm probably going a little bit too fast though. So. It was evident that the first thing we needed to escape was the spatio-temporal complex and soul-destroying rhythm of a commute to work and home to the suburban house that had been prepared for us. One direction of escape was along a train line and into the aforementioned financial district, where I'd go skateboarding with a small gang of malcontents. Travelling far and wide on a £1.20 All Zones travel card, we'd also learned to get several people past barriers on each card. So another line of flight was into the forest, where we used to play as youngsters, and more regularly as I became 16 and older, regularly drink until late under the stars. And around this period, from 93 to 95, we'd sometimes bump into strangers walking home from raves, or even people we knew walking through the forest back from raves and outdoor sound system parties. And they'd sort of talk about having been dancing for 2 days, and we couldn't kind of believe it, but they seemed convincing, but we didn't really understand what was going on. Another important aspect of both these lines of flight, skateboarding and drinking in the forest, was music. And in the woods, we used to have a modest sound system of our own. Throughout the years 1992 to 94, I recall sharing a stereo between two musical styles, hardcore, or so-called happy hardcore, which was a fast electronic music with choppy synths and scattering beats, and on the other hand, indie or guitar music such as the Smiths, The Cure, and then current bands like the Happy Mondays or Charlatans. The musical split corresponded to the two different types of schools we attended, and those into hardcore coming from state-provided schools, those into guitar music or holding on to guitar music being from the public schools, which charged tuition fees. It wasn't strictly a class distinction, since both parties had working class and middle class members, but as well as petty matters such as which cigarette brand each of us smoked, this was one significant way we culturally recognized and distinguished ourselves, for a while at least. So at the time I was on the side of indie music and kind of considered it the sort of happy hardcore, just kind of noise or childish music, but we kind of made a compromise where we very kind of fairly divided the stereo in half. We could have done it right channel, left channel, but we didn't technically know how to do that at the time. So I'm just going to play you, because happy hardcore really didn't sound like any music I'd heard before. I hadn't really heard house. It wasn't really played on the radio much, but maybe some electronic music like Kraftwerk. But happy hardcore just sounded kind of extraordinary. So I'll just play you a kind of one of the more palatable examples of that.
I get hype when I hear drum roll. I get hype. I get hype when I hear drum roll. I get hype. I get hype when I hear drum roll.
Get the general gist. Yeah, maybe kind of later we can come back to sort of just some of the kind of crossover with psychedelic culture and this sort of futurity, what I kind of call the futurity of rave. To kind of more concrete matters, and thinking about looking back with hindsight, we could kind of isolate the period of 1989, which was the so-called Summer of Love, when the kind of highest, the most kind of raves happened. 1989 to 1990 and 1993 as crucial turning points in the developing culture of raving and electronic dance music in the UK. 1989 had seen the establishment of significant resources by the police to gather information on and suppress the large-scale ticketed parties taking place around the edge of London and throughout the UK. Chief Superintendent Keith Tappenden, who had also been involved in coordinating repression against the miners' strike in the earlier 80s or mid-80s, set up the so-called Pay Party unit in 1989. Initially, the police had little clue about how to manage these, or police these nomadic and decentralized parties. This is a quote by Ken Tappenden. He said, "We were logging something like 300 or 400 parties per month at the height of that summer, 1989. There was a movement of traffic, movement of people, and we were losing a bit of control." The unit waged for this next year, the unit waged a high-tech war of attrition on the party scene, setting up roadblocks, harassing partygoers, sowing misinformation, surveying pirate radio stations, party organizers, DJs, scaffolding, and sound system crews. With 200 detectives logging information from all over the country, towards the end of 1989, the Pay Parties unit database held 5,725 names and details on 712 vehicles. Within weeks, their 200 officers had monitored 4,300 phone calls and made 258 arrests. So this the evidence that came from this led to legislation in 1990 with the so-called Entertainment Increased Penalties Bill, which raised fines for throwing an unlicensed party from 2,000 to 20,000, as well as a penalty of a possible 6 months in prison. And kind of during this period, kind of from 1988, 87, 88, the kind of rave culture had been like a small phenomenon in central London, in either kind of nightclubs or in leisure centres, and then it kind of been picked up by largely these kind of entrepreneurial figures who started to run huge raves on the outskirts of London around the M25, which was a kind of radial road that Margaret Thatcher had built very controversially at the time. So this kind of bill basically pushed these illegal parties towards licensed legal clubs. And spatially, this meant the movement again centralized and concentrated in urban areas, in tighter and smaller spaces. And this seems to have had something to do, as well as this kind of criminalization and then kind of commercialization, seems to have had something to do with a more antagonistic turn in the music, which went towards kind of even more broken beats and aggressive vocals sampled from dancehall, ragga, and hip hop. So I'm wondering if that's good. So in the interim, however, there was also a reaction of sorts, or a countervailing movement, with many the early ravers seeking to, quote, return to the source. Sorry. The good vibes and chaos and heterogeneity of the early parties. A group called Spiral Tribe consciously tried to take things underground again, and began by holding small raves in squatted buildings in London in 1990. They then built up a mobile sound system and began taking it to the free festival circuit in 1991 and 1992. And these festivals, which happened all over the UK, were basically like small village fairs, but they've been a kind of strong part of a counterculture from the 60s. They've been kind of taken over by hippies who were kind of interested in this sort of both pagan and local revival. And then travelers also used to frequent them and play folk music. So Spiral Tribe essentially turned up with this very kind of bizarre sort of mishmash of house, breakbeats, hip hop, and kind of proto techno, and large sound systems, and would kind of dance for several days outdoors in the open air. So the Spirals and other mobile sound systems initially eluded police attention because the force's focus had been on paying parties, and their parties were always free. But they eventually attracted some of the heaviest repression yet, culminating in the arrest of 13 members of Spiral Tribe, the confiscation of all their equipment, and a long trial immediately in the wake of a huge, renowned Castle Morton outdoor party, which had something like 700,000 people at it in Scotland. So 1992, 93, a certain era was over. In the late 1992, Spiral Tribe moved to mainland Europe and began like a splinter movement known as the Technival scene of also kind of free outdoor parties. As the 1990s rumbled on, the legal aspect of the dance scene continued to expand commercially, while its illegal and free instantiation was to face further criminalization. If in 1989 some of the euphoria had sprung from a massive burst of liquidity unleashed by Thatcher's boom, and from the spectacular political changes occurring globally as the Eastern Bloc collapsed and a student worker alliance openly challenged Chinese authorities in Tiananmen Square, by 1993 the financial liquidity in the UK was drying up, and the political room for manoeuvre was shrinking as unemployment doubled within the year, and it became clear that authoritarianism was alive and well in the West. So I'm just going to play a track which kind of maybe gives you a kind of example of how the music kind of became, it kind of around 1992, 93, really started to change and kind of splinter into a lot of different kind of types of music, but also specifically new, essentially what's considered almost the UK's original invention in terms of its relationship to house music. And this is known as jungle or dark or later drum and bass. Just have to look for the track, so give me a second. So this track also, just because been trying with this project as much as possible to kind of feed in and relate kind of people's actual employment conditions and this kind of dialectic between employment and unemployment that was so crucial. The maker of this track, the DJ Rap, was originally a stripper. She's one of the very few female jungle DJs, and she became a kind of hardcore and techno DJ, and then eventually a jungle producer in '92. And so, and in this track, you kind of see the influence of essentially jungle involved, like kind of like merger between breakbeat taken from hip hop and kind of dub reggae. So there's lots of kind of dub reggae and dancehall samples, often a kind of very strong sort of references to kind of gangster culture, to guns. It's kind of this much more kind of aggressive and urban feeling than this sort of more kind of like sort of spiritual and kind of optimistic kind of rave and outdoor culture of rave that had happened before.
Where they come from, southwest, east or north. This is the roughest gonna come and take back no dog. Hear this, watch out. We are the roughest gunner from out of South Park. Any boy test we have to draw a gun for. We are the roughest gunner from out of South Park. Any boy test we have to draw a gun for. We are gonna dust out your blood. We are gonna shut out your blood. We are gonna dust out your blood. We are gonna shut out your blood. Watch out! We are gonna dust out your blood. We are gonna dust out your blood. We are gonna dust out your blood. We are gonna shut out, we are the roughest. We are gonna dust out your blood. We are gonna dust out your blood. We are gonna dust out your blood. We are gonna shut out, we are the roughest. 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 Gun out from out of South Park. Any boy says we have to draw a gun for. We are the roughest. Gun out from out of South Park. Any boy says we have to draw a gun fast. Boys on that joke your right gets your out on. The ragamuffin when no scared not laughed on. We face bed cause we not beg no friend. This and I got the bug up and we mark 10. We are the roughest.
Okay, stop. So, I mean, it's interesting because I think it was very clearly kind of had a hostility that the previous kind of, I mean, the rave music may have sounded like kind of noise, and the happy hardcore kind of culture already had this hardcore, which, you know, kind of was always this sort of impetus towards pushing the music, pushing it kind of more underground, pushing it to be more kind of frenetic. And jungle borrowed this sort of attitude and this kind of something like a kind of violent sound or violent references, but actually a lot of the Top Cat, who's the MC rapping on top of the track, is actually when he says he's the roughest sound, he's talking about like a kind of sound clash in a kind of dancehall situation. So he's actually the kind of violence and animosity is this sort of staged confrontation between two sound systems rather than like a kind of like actual kind of gang violence or street violence. There's a kind of lot of play with that. Around, let's see if I can find a picture. Sorry. Okay, around 1993 or 94, a friend played me a track by a producer called Origin Unknown, Valley of the Shadows, and this is the track, the record label you see behind me. The record was pressed in Hornchurch, Essex, which was about 2 or 3 miles from where I grew up, with sparse instrumentation, few piano riffs, vocals or recognizable synth stabs, driving bass, broken beats, which seemed both at once slow and fast. It seemed completely different from anything I'd heard up until that point. I asked my friend Chris what people were calling this music, and he replied that it didn't have a name yet. He didn't know who'd made the track. People just said, quote, "It's dark." It was the beginning of this major crossover, since till then the strength of reggae and dub in the UK had been quite separate from house and techno. And suddenly the two genres began to merge and feed into each other. Soon I wasn't listening to music made with guitars anymore. I began to find different illegal raves, clubs and record shops by queuing outside of nightclubs, finding drugs, other parties, records, squatted spaces, finding pirate radio stations like Cool FM, Touchdown, Defection, Pulse, Rush, simply by spinning the dial on my radio at home. So finding record shops through personal recommendations or drifting around the city. And these media objects pointed to each other, overlaps, were found and charged with a sense of chance. A particular important moment for me was when I found a shop called Ambient Soho stocking so-called white label records, which carried new sounds I liked and also often came with zines and sometimes sleeves with other information like lists of URLs on the back pointing to websites. I found important text for my own self-understanding written by Howard Slater, who Kuda have been working with quite extensively through exactly these channels, through a record label called Praxis, which was linked to a zine called Dataside, which published Howard Slater's writing and had put out a vinyl edition of Howard's zine, Breakflow. So I just find the slide. Yeah. So this is what was usually for Howard like small compilations of his writing, published as pamphlets. And in this case, he made an EP with like about 5 or 6 other contributions from musicians as well as Howard's own. So there was this feeling as I kind of put all this together later in the 90s that this media was incessantly reflecting upon the conditions of its own making and the milieu that was making it. And the following's a quotation from Howard's text, Post-Media Operators. Post-media activity is not the outcome of a discursive resolution which would only lead to another discourse, but is a process that allows contradictions to be pushed in the direction of enigmas and provocative alloys. It allows for experimental positions without coordinates. It drifts off a map, flees from forced identification and forced subjectivization, and takes with it the masks and tools that would enslave it. And so auto-theorization is a constant vigilance, a controlled loss, a permutability of the rational and the unconscious, a processing of the self-revealing social process, being both screen and projector, receiver and sender, silent and voluble, being the margins of a center that doesn't exist. It occupies a liminal position that, in continually being dispersed, coincides and overlaps with a post-media practice, whose overall rhythms are broader, a breath that can turn to history and precursors. This makes me sort of think a lot about the kind of organizing function that this music had, the kind of primacy rather than the the kind of the sort of hit of the individual track, although many people had favorite individual tracks, but rather they were kind of played in this sort of seamless whole, and the kind of organizing of kind of new shapes of people in terms of this sort of spatial geography around London, around which people were dispersed, and also the kind of the sort of essential formlessness of those kind of first encounters when you walked into a abandoned warehouse and into a big room just with some large speakers and maybe some lights. This kind of sense of disorientation, losing yourself in a crowd, finding yourself, kind of organizing yourself and your friends into some kind of dance floor or staying in contact. This was all kind of very new and kind of played out again and again, kind of quite differently. So you'd often reflect kind of after a night out or a weekend out on, you know, what the situation was, what the space was like, what you saw, what you heard, which parts you caught, and these sort of fragments form this kind of irreducible whole, and the kind of impetus was to kind of communicate that to others. So there's this sense of extending one's small circle of communication and one's perceptual equipment through this intersection of media. This also suggested that you too could seize these media, vinyl, radio, sound, print, and to use, redistribute, and make similar connections. The media, as I've said, pointed to each other, not so much in a causal chain as a constellation or maze from which one could gain a vague, suggested direction rather than an authoritative instruction. A good example would be the way early rave flyers simply carried phone numbers to call to get information of the whereabouts of a party. A piece of paper led to a phone line which referred to a map which led you to a building, site, and the all-important music. See if we can find I have an example here. So this was from the back of a flyer called Roadblock, and the kind of joke in that was that such was the mass of people driving around this giant ring road around London, looking for several parties at once, was that actually kind of silting up the traffic. So sometimes the police would try and stop parties by just making a blockade, but then the whole motorway would fill up completely surrounding the city. So it's a sort of play with this as well, and this sort of this kind of dispersion, concentration became kind of a theme and a play in both the kind of titles of the music and the way the promoters dealt with it as well. So this was, there was a sense this kind of information was time sensitive and often redundant beyond the first 6 hours just before the event. Pirate radio stations also made announcements for the parties, offering a fleeting central node from which to broadcast to its listeners and thus distribute them to the party locations. This was a funny example, thinking about the kind of the non-relation of this movement with politics. So this was a party group called Biology in 1990. The radio broadcast went like this. This is a party political dance broadcast on behalf of the Biology Party. Here are the following requirements for this Saturday's DJ convention and gathering of young minds. Firstly, you must have a Great Britain road atlas. Yes, that's a Great Britain road atlas. Secondly, a reliable motor with a full tank of gas. Lastly, you must have a ticket and you must be a member. So we now end this party political dance broadcast on behalf of the Biology Party. Don't waste your vote. Stand up and be counted, because biology is on. So this was kind of detritus of the sort of hysteria that appeared in the press and the kind of crackdown by police. This is a sort of assemblage of various news headlines at the time. Kind of initial commercialization of these parties was about selling T-shirts with kind of acid house logos on them. Okay, this is sort of emblematic. This is by this was published by a fanzine called Boy's Own, which was basically started off as a kind of like a soul and football kind of fans zine, but also kind of crossed into gay culture. And one of their member was had been involved in zine culture for a long time through the punk era. There was a famous zine called Sniffing Glue, early punk zine, and they kind of continued that attitude, or in a way that kind of explicit attitude of DIY culture, do it yourself. So there's this sort of sense of, everybody can do it. It's really easy, and this kind of, and this is what often gets missed in this kind of drier, sort of later formalization of kind of the music and the culture. It's often people relate, for example, Mark Fisher was in a group called CCRU who were relating drum and bass and the kind of deterritorialization of this music to kind of Deleuze and Guattari and very sort of abstract concepts, but that completely kind of squashed what was this sort of cheeky, irreverent humor. So it's a sort of a sense of exodus, succession, and sedition was ever present in the names of venues, tracks, and artist names. This cheeky, irreverent humor, in-jokes, and subversion were an important part of this. And this is kind of really made clear, and if you look back at Boy's Own, who were kind of would consider themselves sort of like music aficionados. They really knew their tracks like better than anybody else. They knew a lot about the history of music, but nonetheless there was kind of more sort of playful, fun, hooligan culture, and also a sense that you just assembled these tracks very quickly and got them out very quickly. There was a kind of very fast feedback loop between the speed with which people were pressing records and then playing them, taking them to the DJs, taking them out. So I think I'll play something else and then jump ahead a little bit. Okay. So I mentioned this sort of the speed with which these kind of outdoor ticketed parties in the 90s kind of built up, and this track kind of reflects this the slightly sort of the bafflement that was kind of beginning as the kind of parties became more and more expensive, and this sort of tension with commodification that kind of was there in the kind of 90s and then came back in 93 as the UK hit a recession. So this track is called 20 quid to get in, £20 to get in, and that's quite a substantial amount of money for a concert even in the 2000s. So I'll just play the beginning because it starts with a sample.
Hello? Excuse me, mate. Can you tell me where the meeting place is for that jam happening tonight? What's it called? Zenity, Energy, Remedy, happening down at Sabotia.
Well, mate, what you do, you go around the roundabout, you see the light, you turn left, you go in the flat, and you see a petrol station, right? Stay in here, mate. We'll pick you up, right?
So how much is it to get in then?
It's 20 quid, mate.
20 quid? I thought it was £10 to get in.
No, man, it's not a remix.
Okay, so before this, they've made a track called 10 quid to get in, and what happens, it's probably not that audible, but what happens on the call is a raver phones up the party line. He says, I want to go to this rave, Energy, Remedy, I don't know what it's called, because a lot of the raves had these similar names, and the guy gives him these very baroque instructions for where to go to the roundabout, the petrol garage, stop there, then give us a call, we'll pick you up. And then he says, how much is it to get in? And the operator on the phone says, it's 20 quid to get in. He says, what? I thought it was £10. He says, this is a remix. And then the track starts. So, yeah, anyway, that was... yeah, so moving a little bit forward. Okay, the 1990s. Okay, the 1990s marked the beginning of the period of the so-called reimposition of work. More specifically, the full shift to what Thatcher had begun from an industrial empire in the kind of decline from the industrial empire, the attack on that, and the transition to a globally networked service provider. And this was quite, this was kind of summed up in the confrontation. Basically, the first protest I ever went on was the so-called criminal justice bill, protest against the criminal justice bill. This had been essentially widespread reforms. Maybe I'll go back a little bit, so sorry. So the 1980s had begun with a conservative government led by Margaret Thatcher and high unemployment. For the following decade, into the 1990s, the general culture had been characterized by the refusal of work, or could be characterized by the refusal of work, dropping out, and a recalcitrant working class who had fiercely opposed Thatcher's reforms of the welfare state and the destruction of industry. In order to allow Thatcher's cohorts in the booming financial industries to asset strip and public services, thousands were thrown into unemployment or precarious work, public housing was run down, vast swathes of industrial real estate was made empty. One of Thatcher's government's few concessions at the time was to leave relatively untouched the unemployment and housing benefits for the unwaged and low-waged. And this led to lively subcultures, supported by a reasonable state allowance, literally squatting and socializing in the material detritus left by Thatcher's measures. After a reign ended in 1990, the Conservative government remained in power. And as the brief boon from deindustrialization faded, economic stagnation set in. With the media uproar about the party scene, free festivals, etc., it was time to take on the subculture, to discipline and redivision the class. And this, the preamble to this has been a series of hard confrontations I mentioned with people organizing free parties and illegal raves. So this is a quote from a text by a group called Alfhaven. The Conservative government faced the problem of class rule in a new economic reality of global finance capital. The problem they face seems to be defying any easy resolution, is simply the need to impose austerity, the need to attack the gains of an entrenched working class without destroying the fragile conservative social consensus represented by the Essex man phenomenon. With the dream of a property-owning democracy sinking into the nightmare of debt, the consensus is rapidly becoming unravelled. But UK PLC cannot retreat. What better tonic than a good old attack on those firmly outside of a deal, the marginalised, whose exclusion the Conservative deal was predicated upon, to stiffen up the resolve in the ranks for those attacks which threaten to recompose the class. But even such an apparently uncomplicated weapon has been threatening to blow up in the faces of those trying to use it. So what happened, in fact, was that this bill proposed, which was sought to kind of shut down illegal raves, but also made various kind of incursions on and limitations on the freedom to assembly, the right to assembly, the right to protest, and so on, met this kind of huge and very kind of chaotic opposition made up of ravers, new age travelers, older travelers, the unemployed, activists of all kinds. And these were the first protests that I went on. I picked up a flyer outside a club. I was like 16 at the time and went with my school friends to these rallies, which often started from a meeting point but kind of went all over the place, all around central London, involved sound systems, lots of people out their heads on the drugs, very few political banners. People tended to attack the police as soon as they saw them, rather than wait for some sort of confrontation. And this became extremely kind of difficult for the police to manage, and also in a way became this sort of movement which wasn't really, you know, in some ways the vague kind of communication was, it was about people's right to party and a kind of general hedonistic lifestyle anyway, maybe a kind of anti-work and dole culture, but it didn't really have a kind of coherent, had no program, it didn't have a coherent political program. Alfhaben write that the movement may be considered in some ways paradigmatic of class struggle in the era following the retreat of social democracy, unhindered by any powerful mediating force, and as such both relatively incoherent in its attempts to express its demands and potentially explosive. We seem to be moving towards a situation where the traditional means of recuperation of struggles and integration of its subjects, the left, is finding itself increasingly incapable of representing struggles occurring outside the productive sphere. This retreat of social democracy is itself a consequence of new global realities. So I mean, what's interesting about what they say is I'm going to kind of try and put that in relation to some more recent social movements and kind of expand some of these claims and expand also in terms of where the music kind of went globally. But just before that, I just want to play a short news clip, which was kind of maybe gives you an idea of the kind of situations and sort of confrontations with the police that were happening. And these were, although I saw this at a few raves in the late 2000s, these were also, it's kind of a vast subterranean, largely unrecorded phenomenon in the, all over the country, especially outside of London. There were quite hard clashes between police and youngsters, and even where the youngsters, when their rave was kind of busted by the police and broken up, they would actually retaliate by going to the police station and freeing the people who'd been arrested, or even in some cases burning the police station down. This is like far, I mean, and this happens really up to the last few years. So this is like and it's not anything, very few people actually kind of talk about this in terms of the history. So if I can find the clip.
Reinforcements were called in from Cambridgeshire, Suffolk and Essex to help remove ravers from an industrial estate in Great Yarmouth. Earlier, a mob had tried to storm the police station. Bottles and beer cans were thrown. In a moment, I'll be asking the Deputy Chief Constable of Norfolk what happened. But first, this report from Kim Riley.
Posted on the YouTube website the moment dozens of police in riot gear moved in to evict ravers gathered in a Yarmouth factory yard. Today, Thermoglow, which makes heating elements, was back in business working normally. But the Office of Quality Assurance Manager Stuart Smithson, broken into by the ravers to get power for their sound system, then barricaded against the police advance, was wrecked.
It certainly made a mess of my office. There was not much left of it. computers are gone, the fans gone, cameras are gone, and as you can see, the desks and the office equipment just broken to pieces.
The partygoers broke onto the site through a rear entrance. After fleeing the police, many of their cars were today still waiting to be recovered. Some were keen to show off their wounds, including bites from police dogs, complaining of brutality.
People were trying to get away and falling over and getting hit with the shields and the batons. Their shields are used to push, they're digging at us. They're not pushing us with them, they're hitting us with them.
They treat us like animals, basically. I've been to a few raves and it's got out of control a few times, but they've taken it a step too far, I think, personally.
Some other ravers say the police were very brutal.
Well, that's their opinion. I mean, as a bystander, I thought the police were very professional. They're obviously trained to carry out this sort of operation. Yes, there was force, but, you know, when you've got people throwing bottles and stones and other things at you, they did the job.
The night had begun with up to 100 people surrounding Yarmouth Police Station, throwing missiles after 3 of their number were arrested and sound equipment seized. From the operational commander today, no apology for tough policing.
When you think about the scenario of officers having full beer cans being thrown at their faces, we had scaffolding poles being used against officers, in fact one of those stuck in one of our officers' helmets. The level of violence was absolutely outrageous.
So far, 8 people have been charged with public order offences and are due in court on September the 6th. Kim Riley, BBC Look East, Great Yarmouth.
Let's talk.
Okay. I'm not sure if it's in that bit, but at one point I find 2 really interesting things. First, the manager of the warehouse says the police did a good job, which was kind of funny in the situation where these ravers were not only invading a kind of empty factory, a site of work, in order to kind of dance, but also that they kind of actually destroyed a kind of live working production in the process. And this is what I kind of partly mean about this ambivalence around work and how it's expressed not as kind of a demand or a kind of protest, but actually as kind of direct sort of kind of energy, just like we want to expend our energy kind of exhausting ourselves, taking drugs and dancing, kind of wrecking the productive infrastructure, or what was left of it, by Thatcher in the kind of course. So I'm just going to show you by contrast, because my experience from the 90s was of this kind of process of a reimposition of work. I kind of came out of university, I was on unemployment benefit for some time, and then it was like things just began to kind of speed up. So this sense that this kind of new network technology, which had been experimented with by both in terms of mobile phones, but also the internet, was kind of becoming part of a kind of generalized speed up in the UK of working culture. Also, as kind of property prices rose, benefits were kind of reduced, people were kind of forced onto the job market. And one kind of peculiar sort of legacy, in a way, of this music is that we find kind of the way the kind of maybe the descendants of kind of rave in the UK inherited a sort of strange kind of ambivalence, in the one way of kind of affirming a kind of gangster culture, kind of grey economy, of which rave culture was definitely had kind of gangs operating, or eventually became quite violent in some respects, but also affirming this kind of commercialism, affirming kind of selling records in huge numbers, affirming kind of making money generally, whether it's by illegal means or by kind of legal means. And so I'm going to play you a very recent track by a young grime MC called Jeremy. And there's a sort of peculiar twist to this track, which it took me a while to understand it. The track was released just last year. The so-called grime MCs kind of famously aggressive about controlling their copyright. Although it was kind of began as a strong kind of mixtape culture and also has all these aspects of the earlier rave culture where people were sampling each other and also overdubbing each other's songs and tracks, even, you know, using the same instrumental to make insults to the producer. But it seems as they've begun to have some sort of small opening of commercial success. They've become extremely kind of vigilant, and they'll actually kind of personally hound YouTube users and people on file sharing networks by like threatening them and sending them emails and even, you know, trying to find where they live if they live in the UK. So the peculiar twist with this track is it has been kind of appropriated and someone's kind of uploaded it to YouTube as a piece of their own original work, because they've applied a technique which is called speed art, which involves doing kind of very intensive Photoshop work on an image or even a moving image, a video, and recording that, so doing a live capture of your screen and then kind of playing that back as a video. But in this case, they've done it on grime track, and the grime track happens to be about work, and in a very affirmative sense, it's about work. So it's kind of like many strange layers, and I'll talk a bit more about that after. Okay.
Be 10 bags or 10p. I used to live off my overdraft, but now my account is never empty. All my supporters rep me, and half of them ain't even met me. Live off my overdraft, but now my account is never empty. All my supporters rep me, and half of them ain't even. My supporters rep me, and half of them ain't even. My supporters rep me, and half of them ain't even met. All my supporters rep me, and half of them ain't even met.
Hard work pays off. If you want something, work towards it. Work hard. The harder you work, the faster you get where you want to get.
The only time you've got a TT is if you drink Thai food and Tetley. My flow so sick it will uppercut Kimbos like Jackie Chan and Jet Li. You people are gonna respect me. Bet I'll make you respect me. This flow's deadly. It will resurrect Bruce Lee to be the famous Deadly. The only day that I don't put in no work is the 30th of February. Do not fuck with my money. It can be 10 bags or 10p. I used to live off my overdraft, but now my account is never empty. All my supporters rep me, and half of them ain't even met me. It's not easy. Trust me. Hard work. Cause I'm putting in work.
Trust me.
You gotta put in that work.
Everything you want.
Man, I'm putting in work.
Anything.
You gotta put in that work. Cause I'm putting in work.
Work hard.
You gotta put in that work.
It's not easy.
Man, I'm putting in work.
Trust
You
me.
gotta put in that work.
Hard work.
I wear snowboarding boots to festivals. You can't tell me about style. You're drinking your lager out on the field, but your name ain't Carl. All the shit you do I've done, but I ain't touched alcohol in a while. I used to blaze, I turned 21, then I dropped the monk out just like Jamal.
What?
I moved on and I dropped Smokey out just like Jamal. I'm the 8th wonder of the world, so come see me, not the Taj Mahal. You want that Beamer, you want that Merc. Money, cars, clothes, those are the perks. But to get there, you gotta put in that work. It's not easy. You gotta put in that work. Trust me. Put in that work. Hard work. Cause I'm putting in work.
Anything you
You
want.
gotta put in that work.
Absolutely
Man, I'm
anything.
putting in work.
You gotta put in that work.
You gotta put in that work.
Work
Cause I'm
hard.
putting in work.
Trust me.
You gotta put in that work.
It's not easy.
Man, I'm putting in work.
Believe
You
me.
gotta put in that work.
Hard work.
To those who don't know me, hello. You think you control me? And no, I'm one of the best artists in the world, and I leave other MCs below. If you ain't heard of me, hello. Keep up, stop moving slow. Boy, wanna know what boy better know means for you to find out and for me to know. If you know my face, salute. Parlez-vous français, salut. Je m'appelle JME. Let me show you around this jungle like Baloo. When you next see my face, salute. If not, here's some air for you. If it kicks off, then jump in first. Don't care if it hurts, man. Put in that work. It's not easy. Gotta put in that work. Trust me. Put in that work. Hard work. Cause I put in work.
You can get anything.
You gotta put in that work.
Just put in that work.
Man, I put in work.
And work hard.
You gotta put in that work.
Get your goal.
Cause I put in work.
Trust me.
You gotta put in that work.
Nothing's easy.
Man, I put in work.
You wanted that
You
bad.
gotta put in that work.
Hard work.
So it goes on, uses another track, but I mean, I found this kind of very both interesting and disturbing, in that I really like the track. I think it's great. I think I like his kind of flow, his lyrical flow, and I like the beats behind it. But the kind of spirit of the track is kind of horrible. It's like this kind of sort of you've got to work hard. Only I can make it. Nobody else can make it. It's all about competition, treading on kind of everybody around you in order to be the one who makes it. And this seems to be sort of indicative of, in a way, this latter movement. There's clearly a lot less record sales in the industry than previous times. Even a lot of people didn't really make huge amounts of money. But the rave culture, there was such a huge revival of vinyl and a huge circulation of vinyl, and that's really kind of come to its end. Grime as a scene was kind of very heavily kind of criminalized and considered dangerous, and was not provided with grime artists weren't provided with very many opportunities to play in clubs because of its kind of bad name. And JME is one of the few artists who has some exposure, but it's like quite clear that he's not making a lot of money like Madonna or other stars. So there's a sort of, in a way, this kind of affirmation of work also comes from the desperately seeking work. And we could kind of contrast it maybe with something equally, trying to be equally commercial, which is Missy Elliott's Work It song, which also, although I think it's very much just work as a metaphor for sex, but in it you see this kind of this celebration of kind of pure expenditure rather than this kind of compulsion. She talks about slavery in the track as well, and this is a kind of, in a sense, it's kind of post-work. It's not kind of like desperately seeking work. It kind of expresses a sort of jouissance in this kind of moment of suspension outside of work that doesn't celebrate competition. It's going to play another, what's quite, in a way, I find, apart from some grime artists, the UK's kind of legacy of, and in a way, some few people, still trying to organise kind of free and illegal parties. The kind of electronic scene, in its kind of mass mode or in its popular mode, has kind of stagnated in the UK. But I think there's other cultures and other kind of parts of the world that have sort of picked up the threads and literally like the samples and the production qualities of the rave scene. So I'm going to just play an example from South Africa. And this group, LV, signed to a UK label called Hyperdub, and so they gained a bit of exposure recently in the UK, but I'm kind of playing it mostly to just show you a bit of a contrast with JME's piece.
Yeah, you can download this on MP3 or when we keep it live, OMFG, TV, SABC4, roof on fire, yeah, we C4. There's nothing like MX90s, bro. There's something about 325s, bus donors, streets come alive, townships to all work 925s. Sasebenza after 5 we come alive. 247 365, 247 365. Sasebenza, what? Sasebenza only rest in December. Sasebenza, what? Sasebenza only rest in December. Sasebenza, what? Sasebenza only rest in December. Sasebenza, what? Cyan, magenta, yellow, black, Mac, MacBook Pro processor. I play alpha, spicy omega. We stay fly with the lost airbenders. They go hard, but I MC ham. Sasebenza, what? Sasebenza only rest in December. Sasebenza, what? Sasebenza only rest in December. Sasebenza, what? Sasebenza only rest in December. Sasebenza, what? Tastemaker, next season planner. I stay fly, I Peter Pan. I'm Peter Parker, stay fly, never land. I never die, multiply, Highlander. Slender, big booty bender. Since a way back, they've been trying to silence us. They even tried silencers. Rubber bullets. Check. I go shambis on this verse. Jack of all trades, master of the universe, the pose, equator, the axis, the tropics, the Davis, the Moses, boss of all forces, black unicorn, I'm a horse of all horses, Kukat, boss of all bosses, sons of the sun, source of all sources, Tipisi for zonke, best for all purpose, talent, the hard work, source of all profits, big things, big deposits, big things, big deposits. The grabbing hands grab all they can.
Okay, so the analogy in a way that I'm trying to make and just try to develop just for the last bit of this talk is the last line, the kind of title of this track is Sesebenza. Sesebenza just means work in South African. So it's a kind of and it's a perspective on work, which is like they talk about basically how informally they have to work all the time. They don't rest till December. And also they show these pictures of the city, the kind of remoteness that they are from the kind of the capital city, from Johannesburg, from the kind of these sort of rich financial buildings. And the final line that they end on is this kind of repetitive kind of chorus, the grabbing hands grab all they can, which is both a kind of like indictment of corruption in South Africa, contemporary South Africa, but also to a certain extent their situation. And I kind of think about the analogy with, in a way, the 90s, the 80s and 90s in the UK seems like this kind of energy, this huge energy expended in kind of organizing raves, making music, people dancing all weekend, seems to have a relationship to this kind of also sort of wageless life that can't be meaningfully absorbed back into the general economy. So, and this is the kind of, we talked about this opposition of aesthetics to political economy, but this is also a kind of excess that is to do with kind of new sensory experiences, but also it's like fundamentally a kind of broad cultural experience. And especially now, I mean, this track's from last 2 years ago. This is a kind of broader and expanding globally experience that actually people are kind of in capitalist social relations, but outside of capitalist mode of production. And the global revolts that we've seen in kind of recent years in Egypt and elsewhere have activated, Ukraine more recently seems to have activated a kind of surplus humanity at different points in a class spectrum, which encompasses both the peripheral life of a casualized lumpen proletariat, elements of a factory proletariat for whom the social democratic class deal is now far from reciprocal, and sections of the educated proletarianized middle class. I'm going to show another example of kind of where I think musically kind of rave music has moved interestingly, and I also think it's kind of part of a generation within this kind of, around this kind of category of wageless life or surplus humanity. It's from Chicago, and you could, let's see, I'll just put it very low. So I think here, because the music quality is very poor, but I'll put up the music a little bit in a moment. You get this kind of very strong, there was a kind of moment when black house music in Chicago went kind of back underground and stopped to have, kind of somewhere in the early 90s, stopped to have a kind of big commercial circulation. So people were still making the music, but they were just making it on tapes, and people were kind of consuming this more in the like local community settings. In either, there were some clubs, but they were often kind of criminalized by the police. So actually, this culture of dance battles grew up, which is also like about providing a kind of like spaces for youth who are basically going to spend their time on the street otherwise, and kind of actually, you'll see in this, like kind of not productively, but kind of unproductively expending this kind of energy, which, you know, is quite full of aggression, as you'll see in this kind of dance. So this is two kind of dance crews, and basically they do a kind of face-off, and just there's this is a two-part. I think it's Terror Creation, and I can't remember the other group, and yeah, they basically dance to this extremely kind of this music that's made both with very fast breaks but also very slow samples, and there's this kind of interaction between kind of like kind of intense speed and acceleration, and also just like total kind of laid backness. So a lot of the samples are either sped up very quickly or slowed down intensely, and it seems to kind of express a bit this kind of stuck moment that you're kind of like moving very quickly, but you're not actually kind of like moving in linear time anymore. There's not any kind of history, there's not any kind of clear future. There's a certain futurity to the music, but there's also kind of, and there's like attempts to create new ways to move in a very cramped space, but essentially you're moving on the spot. And I think kind of both Benjamin Noyes and Mark Fisher talk very interestingly about this music, Chicago Duke, about this kind of relationship to time and the kind of stuckness of the political moment that we're in. I'll just put a bit of the music on. me to leave it on? Yeah, I mean, I was sent this by a friend who's a DJ and also a kind of some kind of political genossen, comrade, and it really kind of blew me away, both in terms of the kind of elegance and grace with which these guys are moving, but also the intensity of this kind of music, and there's even very, you know, samples that are very close, or, you know, borrowed directly from kind of the rave movement and happy hardcore, and it really kind of pushed on this kind of some of the thoughts around what that was in the past, what this kind of like lightning, this kind of movement kind of picked up and grew and moved, and it had all sorts of kind of open kind of like directions, spiritual, hippie, kind of gangster, kind of druggy, all these kind of different intellectualized, abstract, but there's a kind of concreteness to this. There's a very little, there's a kind of real perfection. There's a real obsession about the music. There's a real obsession about the dancing. It's like both highly competitive, but as you can see, also quite good-natured and kind of like fun and surreal. There's a kind of peculiar many people kind of used to joke and laugh about the kind of peculiar gestures that people used to make in the kind of rave dance, but essentially people were dehydrated, they're on drugs or drunk and out of control, but there's quite an interesting aspect to this kind of music and this kind of dancing, which is that actually uses facial gesture as part of the dance. So people dance with their affective expressions as well, with either smiling or sneering or contorting their faces. That kind of becomes like a very precise maneuver. Yeah, and I think maybe as we saw, like with the speed art, there's this kind of like interminable kind of concentration of time going on. So there's this kind of like, with the speed art, you're seeing like what was like a day's work probably, or half a day's work for someone at Photoshop, compressed into a 4-minute time. And in this as well, there's like an unbelievable amount of events in terms of the music taking place, but also gestures in terms of the kind of dance taking place. And this is like 10 minutes, about 20 people each have their 50-second piece that they do. Yeah. So I just want to hopefully show 2 more videos. First one is rather political. It comes from Egypt, from just after the kind of fall of Mubarak, in fact, in Egypt, and it comes from a culture of football hooligans who were supporters of one of the 2 main teams in Cairo, who were active in the Egyptian revolution, and at the kind of quite a late stage, almost as a revenge, they were, by the police, they traveled to a game in a town called Port Said, and the police basically contrived to lock them in the stadium, to close all the gates, and searched all the away fans thoroughly, and then basically used local thugs and plainclothes police to massacre over 80 people from the supporters. They basically have kind of developed a strongly political culture, which also uses kind of song or poetry and gesture to kind of talk about their struggles and kind of organize. So this was a kind of demonstration that led directly from a massacre in Port Said into Cairo, and then to a attempted occupation of a TV station. So just, it's probably very loud. Let's see. Okay. Yeah. What I'm interested kind of here. I mean, I think it's interesting that there's a sort of sense of kind of testimony and witness, and this kind of. But I'm equally interested in this kind of novel shape that people are making themselves into, and how that's a kind of shape of further power. So I've been working with a friend in the UK, an artist who's been kind of doing kind of investigation into sort of our Alawi football supporters, and this kind of idea that the way that kind of there's a sort of messianic content to this and other sort of instantiations of poetry, but kind of from a space of blockage, kind of poetry or kind of a certain kind of rhythm, certain kind of patterned language can kind of open a space through which kind of something new can pass. And we've been kind of thinking about it in those terms as like, also with the Chicago example and an example I'm going to show you now, it's like very much this kind of like blocked, intensely stagnant space, either highly policed or kind of closed politically, closed to political change, and actually this kind of new kind of mimetic forms seem to come up into an attempt to kind of grasp an opening of some kind. So, which one? Right. So this is something of a professionalization of what we saw in the Chicago video. It also comes from a different city with a very different style. So this is a Oakland group called Turf Fanes, and they've made a series of videos which commemorate the death of a friend or a kind of noted person. So they made a video about Oscar Grant, who was famously killed by transport police in Oakland. This led to kind of the so-called Oakland Revolt. But in this case, they're commemorating a friend called Rich D's death. I'm not totally clear how he died, but the opening of the video, you see this kind of like mild, kind of subtle antagonism with the police, and although Chicago Duke sometimes happens out on the street as well, and there's this interaction with traffic, all of their dances, in the case of Turf Fanes, are like highly stylized and staged and filmed on the street. And really you see kind of like elements of their daily life that they're just kind of hanging around waiting a lot of the day, and out of this situation a kind of dance is made. Quite an extraordinary set of movements. So, yeah, my talk pretty much ends there. I guess just what I find kind of extraordinary in those, and to kind of relate back to this kind of opposition, interrelation of art or aesthetics and political economy, is this kind of the sense that they express exactly this kind of what appears also present in rave culture, this kind of like development of a flexible subject, a kind of expressive subject, a subject who can command their effect easily and quickly. But this happens in a kind of situation of like a kind of extreme distance from all forms of kind of normal production or job market. It appears mimetic of work, of the gestures of work, but it kind of removes them and propels them instead in a kind of in a sort of form of poetic gesture, in the kind of in an enterprise which commemorates death, kind of needless death. So it's kind of like this both highly vivacious, kind of expressive, elastic kind of movements, but which are kind of dedicated to kind of death or commemoration of people they've lost, but it happens in this kind of very densely regulated, policed, criminalized kind of zones of the city, which are peripheral to capitals. Movements also seems to be a common factor. Yeah, and I kind of wrote in the end these kind of novel compositions, these kind of forms, experiments with forms of organization and new forms of kind of art or new forms of culture which organize, describe these kind of novel concentrations and combinations of energies. They carry their own history and forms of self-reflexivity with them. They are, in the end, the kind of working out of our interminable present and its radical mediations. And that's sort of, I think, the kind of matter of where we are. Oh.
Ako ima odmah pitanja ili komentara, ja imam pitanje i komentar, ali bih želela da dam priliku, pošto je dosta već i kasno, ako neko želi da postavi pitanje. Ok, onda ću ja dok vi još malo razmislite. Then I will try, you have a headphone so you can get a translation. Yeah, about this, like the kind of a thesis that you are all the time going back, you know, like maybe more in a theoretical sense, at least concerned with those beginnings of rave culture. You were stressing that high rate of unemployment kind of like provoked in a way this sort of escapism or escape from the whole notion of the wage labor. I was just thinking, is it possible to look at also, maybe not the other way around, but in a sense that those kind of economic conditions definitely influence, but is there in the rave culture or in the raves formless form of organizing? There is actually political ability that is something else than like immediate economic determination of it.
Yeah, I think if I was doing it a bit more kind of rigorously, I'd say that kind of refusal of work began more in the 70s, and in a sense Thatcher's policies were a consequence of that and responded to both a structural impasse for capital and also something that was facing a kind of antagonistic class subject. But to respond to your question, I think that those abilities, those new abilities, kind of developed in the kind of late 80s, early 90s, did get reabsorbed into, you know, a new kind of economy. So I think that the kinds of work that were created in the 90s and the kinds of enterprise did very much kind of respond to a kind of strong cultural movement and try to absorb it as well. So I mean, it did genuinely did, you know, reanimate the record industry, restructure it to a certain extent. It produced kind of a commercial culture of clubs and leisure, which fitted very well with the kind of the direction that Thatcher had pushed things in terms of making London into a kind of global service providing city, and also the kind of new temporary contracts that were offered suited people's lifestyles who are, you know, getting completely smashed on the weekend, and they could still turn up at a white collar job and just sit in front of a computer, and then didn't really care about the job, didn't really care about progressing, would just go traveling for a while or just get another job. So those kind of conditions came together, but in a sense there were these kind of high points or moments of anti-work kind of antagonism, or this kind of formless antagonism, which I think feel it's worth kind of highlighting, that they weren't just a brief moment, but kind of extend and are still kind of apparent somewhat even end of the 2000s, and could be again as well, or even, well, yeah. I mean, I think another reason for me looking at this again is like the riots in 2011 was like a very important moment and somewhat connected to this whole history. So.
Neko još želi postaviti pitanje? Da, komentar? Ili nastavljamo neformalno? Spremili smo muziku koja je vezana za, dakle, temu predavanja. So we can continue informally, I said, if no one is interested in microphone.
No problem.
Yeah, so we have a music, I said. I introduced.
Cool. Thanks, Branka. Thank you. Thanks. Okay, a bit longer again. Though.